For more than 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, an empire that still called itself Roman continued to stand. Its people spoke Greek, worshipped as Orthodox Christians, and ruled from a city that had once been a Greek colony. It survived plagues, invasions, civil wars, and crusaders. It outlasted kingdoms, witnessed the rise of Islam, and guarded the ancient world's wisdom through an age of fire and transformation. How did the Eastern Roman Empire endure when its western half crumbled? What bound it together for so long? And what finally led to its fall? This is the story of the Eastern Roman Empire. Let's begin. In the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire stood on the brink of collapse. After decades of internal chaos, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had seen over 20 emperors rise and fall in just 50 years. Civil wars, economic instability, and unending invasions from beyond its borders had brought the empire to its knees. It was no longer certain whether Rome could survive as a single unified power. Into this turmoil stepped a man named Diocletian. Born into humble beginnings in the Roman province of Dalmatia, Diocletian rose through the military ranks during those turbulent years. By the year 285, he declared himself emperor after defeating his rival Carinus. But unlike the emperors who came before him, Diocletian did not try to rule as a lone, all-powerful monarch. He understood something vital. The empire had grown too vast, too complex, and too vulnerable to be governed by one man. His solution was revolutionary. He divided the empire. Rather than permanently splitting it in two, Diocletian created what he called the Tetrarchy, government by 4. In this system, the empire would be ruled by 2 senior emperors known as Augusti and 2 junior emperors known as Caesars. Diocletian took control of the eastern half and appointed Maximian to govern the west. Each selected a subordinate to assist and eventually succeed them. This was far more than a bureaucratic fix. It was a fundamental reimagining of Roman power. By allowing multiple emperors to rule separate regions, Diocletian aimed to bring stability, improve military response, and reduce the endless civil wars that had torn Rome apart for decades. Though the Tetrarchy did not last long after Diocletian's retirement in the early 4th century, its effects were lasting. The division between East and West began to take root. Culturally, politically, and administratively, the two halves of the empire started to drift apart. The next great turning point came with the rise of Constantine the Great. Constantine, the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of Diocletian's original Caesars, became the central figure of the early 4th century. After years of brutal civil wars among rival claimants to the throne, Constantine defeated his final opponent, Licinius, in 324 AD. He became the sole ruler of the empire. Constantine's reign transformed Rome in profound ways. Most famously, he converted to Christianity, a religion once persecuted by Roman authorities. Through the Edict of Milan in 313, Constantine legalized Christianity, setting in motion a transformation that would reshape the empire's spiritual identity. In the years that followed, Christianity grew from a once persecuted faith into the dominant religion of Rome. But Constantine's most lasting legacy in the story of the Eastern Empire was his decision to found a new imperial capital in the East. In 330 AD, he officially dedicated the city of Constantinople. Built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, Constantinople sat in a position of unmatched strategic power. It controlled trade routes, commanded naval access, and was naturally fortified by sea and land. Constantine intended it to be a new Rome, a city of commerce, governance, and imperial majesty. Yet it was also a symbol. It represented a shift in the empire's balance. Rome remained sacred in memory and culture, but the empire's true heart had begun to beat in the east. After Constantine's death in 337, his sons and heirs fought bitterly for control. Their civil wars only deepened the divide between East and West. By the end of the 4th century, practical reality had triumphed over sentiment. The empire functioned best when divided. In 395, that division became permanent. When Emperor Theodosius I, the last man to rule both halves, died, he left the empire to his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. From that moment on, there would be two Roman empires, two courts and two destinies. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, was far stronger. It was wealthier, more urbanized and more secure. Its cities were ancient and fortified, its economy steady, and its trade routes abundant. Meanwhile, the Western Empire, governed from Ravenna and Milan, was in decline, weakened by poverty, political chaos, and endless barbarian invasions. While the West moved toward ruin, the East endured and even thrived. The seeds of that endurance had been planted long ago by Diocletian's reforms and Constantine's bold vision. What began as an administrative adjustment had grown into the birth of a new empire, one that would preserve Roman law, culture, and faith long after the West was gone. As the Western Roman Empire staggered into decay during the late 4th and 5th centuries, the Eastern Empire learned to adapt. Its story became one not just of survival, but of reinvention. While the West crumbled, the East stabilized, fortified, and laid the foundation of what would later be called the Byzantine Empire. The formal split of 395 placed Arcadius on the eastern throne and Honorius in the west. Honorius faced crisis after crisis, collapsing finances, military defeats, and unending invasions. In 410 AD, disaster struck. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths under their king Alaric. For the first time in over 800 years, the Eternal City fell to a foreign enemy. The shock was immense. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, mourned, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." But while the West was paralyzed by despair, the East held firm. Under Arcadius and his son Theodosius II, the Eastern Empire focused on preserving stability through both diplomacy and defense. Constantinople, protected by its geography and strengthened by the monumental Theodosian walls built in the early 5th century, became one of the most impregnable cities on earth. Completed by 413, these triple walls, with towers, moats, and stone ramparts, would stand the test of centuries. While Rome burned, Constantinople was building. In the West, imperial authority unraveled. Rival generals and puppet emperors fought over a dying system. The Eastern emperors watched carefully but intervened rarely. They had their own threats to face, the most terrifying of all being the Huns. Under Attila, the Huns surged into Eastern Europe, raiding the Balkans and forcing the empire to pay massive tributes to avoid devastation. During the 440s, Emperor Theodosius II bought time with gold while fortifying his defenses. His strategy worked. When Attila turned his armies westward toward Gaul and Italy, the east was spared. In 453, Attila died suddenly and his empire quickly fell apart. The east, though scarred, endured. The west, leaderless and broken, was nearing its final hour. In 457, a new emperor rose in Constantinople, Leo I. His reign marked a turning point. Unlike earlier rulers who were often controlled by barbarian generals, Leo asserted independent imperial power. He was the first Eastern Roman emperor crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, symbolizing the deepening bond between the throne and the Orthodox Church. Leo strengthened administration and reorganized the military, seeking to restore Rome's lost prestige. He launched a bold but disastrous expedition in 468 to reclaim North Africa from the Vandals, an attempt that drained the empire's coffers but proved his ambition. Despite the failure, Leo left behind a stronger and more stable government. By his death in 474, the Eastern Empire had recovered. The West, however, had not. By the mid-5th century, real power in the West lay not with the emperors, but with generals of Germanic origin like Ricimer. The throne became a revolving door of weak figureheads. Finally, in 476 AD, the Western Empire collapsed. A Germanic warlord named Odoacer deposed the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and declared himself ruler of Italy. He did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging Emperor Zeno as the sole Roman ruler. It was a symbolic gesture. The West had fallen, but Rome lived on in the East. In Constantinople, Zeno did not rush to reclaim the West. His empire was strong but beset by internal revolts and political intrigue. He chose diplomacy over conquest, recognizing Odoacer's rule while maintaining the illusion of a unified empire under Eastern authority. Yet beneath this fiction, a transformation was underway. The Roman Empire was evolving. Its people now spoke Greek rather than Latin. Its religion was fully Christian. Its emperors ruled not only as sovereigns but as defenders of the faith. The survival of the Eastern Roman Empire, through plagues, invasions, and the fall of its Western twin, was no accident. It endured because of its geography, its wealth, its cities, and above all, its leadership. From the ashes of the old world, a new Rome had arisen, one that would shine from Constantinople for 1,000 more years. Constantinople's strategic location made it far easier to defend and maintain connections with the thriving trade networks of Asia Minor and the Eastern Mediterranean. Its immense wealth allowed the empire to fund vast armies, maintain formidable fortifications, and endure crises far more effectively than Rome had in its final decades. Yet survival did not guarantee security. The Eastern Empire constantly faced threats from outside forces and internal divisions. Gothic invasions, religious disputes, and court intrigues continuously tested its resilience. By the early 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire remained the sole heir to Roman tradition. It had withstood the collapse of the West and survived a century filled with external attacks and internal struggles. Under the leadership of one ambitious ruler, it now sought to achieve something extraordinary: the restoration of Rome's former glory. That emperor was Justinian. Justinian was born in the late 5th century in Dardania, in the Balkans. He was not of noble lineage. His family were simple peasants, and his native tongue was likely Latin, though he would later receive education in Greek and Roman traditions. His ascent was made possible by his uncle Justin, a career soldier who climbed the ranks and became emperor in 518. Justinian was adopted as Justin's heir and formally assumed the throne in 527. From the outset, his ambitions were unmistakable. He saw himself not just as the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, but as the restorer of Roman greatness. To him, the empire had been fragmented but not lost. The West, including Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain, were seen as rightful Roman territories temporarily held by barbarian conquerors. His mission was to reclaim them. To realize this vision, Justinian relied on a close circle of skilled and loyal advisors. Foremost among them was his wife, Theodora. She had humble origins and had once worked as an actress, a profession considered disreputable at the time. Yet Justinian made her empress, and she quickly became one of his most trusted and intelligent partners in governance. Theodora played a pivotal role in shaping imperial policy and remained steadfast during crises that might have toppled lesser rulers. Another indispensable figure was Belisarius, Justinian's most capable general. Having already distinguished himself in earlier campaigns, Belisarius would become the central military leader in Justinian's efforts to reclaim the western provinces. But Justinian's ambitions went beyond the battlefield. One of his earliest and most enduring achievements was legal reform. Over centuries, Roman law had grown vast and contradictory, with scattered decrees and conflicting interpretations. Justinian commissioned a comprehensive legal codification known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law completed in stages between 529 and 534. This work became the foundation of Byzantine law and would later influence legal systems across medieval Europe and beyond. While legal reforms strengthened the internal structure of the empire, Justinian turned outward toward conquest. His first major target was North Africa, which had been under Vandal control since the early 5th century. In 533, Belisarius launched a swift, well-coordinated campaign against the Vandals. Within months, Byzantine forces defeated Vandal king Gelimer and re-established imperial authority over the province. Buoyed by this success, Justinian set his sights on Italy, then ruled by the Ostrogoths. The Gothic War proved far more grueling and prolonged. Beginning in 535, the conflict lasted nearly 2 decades. Belisarius captured Rome and several key cities early on, but the Ostrogoths regrouped and mounted fierce counterattacks. At one point, Rome changed hands multiple times. Despite shifts in command and fortunes, the Byzantines eventually prevailed. By 553, a second general, Narses, led renewed operations that decisively defeated the Goths, and by 554 Italy was nominally under imperial control. However, the cost of conquest was immense. Italy lay in ruins after prolonged warfare. Cities were destroyed, farmland lay fallow, and populations had been displaced. Though the Byzantines regained territory, it came at the price of economic exhaustion and lingering resentment from locals who no longer viewed Constantinople as a protective authority, but as a distant foreign ruler. While Italy was contested, Justinian also cast his eyes toward the Iberian Peninsula. A limited campaign in southern Spain captured a handful of coastal cities from the Visigoths around 552. Though minor compared to the African and Italian wars, it reflected Justinian's broader strategy: reclaim as much of the former Roman world as possible. Meanwhile, the eastern frontier demanded attention. The empire faced ongoing tensions with the Sassanid Persian Empire. The two powers had long been rivals, and periodic wars erupted throughout Justinian's reign. Though he eventually negotiated a 50-year peace with Persia in 561, the eastern border remained a source of military strain. While military campaigns extended the empire's reach, Justinian also reshaped Constantinople's cultural and architectural identity. His most iconic project was the rebuilding of Hagia Sophia. After the original structure was destroyed during the Nika riots in 532, Justinian commissioned a new basilica, grander than any before. The Nika riots themselves had nearly ended his reign. Sparked by dissatisfaction with imperial policies and abuses by officials, the unrest began during chariot races at the Hippodrome. It quickly escalated into a full-scale rebellion. Much of the city burned, and imperial authority hung in the balance. Justinian considered fleeing, but Theodora reportedly refused. According to later accounts, she declared, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," persuading him to remain and confront the crisis. Belisarius and another general, Mundus, suppressed the revolt. In a brutal crackdown, tens of thousands of rioters were slaughtered at the Hippodrome. The rebellion was crushed and Justinian's authority restored. In the aftermath, Justinian devoted resources to rebuilding the capital. Hagia Sophia was completed in less than 6 years, symbolizing imperial power and divine favor. Its vast dome, intricate mosaics, and radiant interior became hallmarks of Byzantine architecture, influencing generations to come. Yet for all his achievements, Justinian's reign came with heavy costs and enduring consequences. Wars drained the treasury and left regions vulnerable. Centralization of power alienated segments of the aristocracy and provincial elites. Legal and religious policies sparked controversy, particularly as he enforced orthodoxy and sought to suppress heretical beliefs like monophysitism, still popular in Egypt and Syria. Then came the plague. Around 541, a devastating pandemic, now called the Plague of Justinian, swept through the empire. Believed to be an early outbreak of bubonic plague, it killed massive portions of the population, particularly in cities like Constantinople. Contemporary accounts claim thousands perished daily at the peak. The demographic and economic consequences were severe. Agricultural output plummeted, tax revenues declined, and military recruitment faltered. The combination of plague, wars, and internal unrest plunged the empire into prolonged strain. When Justinian died in 565, he left a complex legacy. He had expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent in centuries. He had codified Roman law, commissioned monumental architecture, and centralized imperial authority. Yet his policies overstretched the empire, and many reconquered territories would soon be lost. Justinian's reign marked both a pinnacle and a breaking point for the Eastern Roman Empire. By the mid-6th century, the state was stretched thin, geographically, economically, and militarily. As the emperor aged, new pressures emerged from all directions. The most immediate was the plague, first appearing around 541, likely originating in Egypt and spreading rapidly via trade routes. Constantinople, the empire's heart, suffered profoundly. Historian Procopius, who served under Justinian, claimed over 10,000 died daily in the capital at its peak. While possibly exaggerated, the scale of mortality was immense. Entire neighborhoods emptied, farmers abandoned fields, soldiers were scarce, and tax collection became nearly impossible. Widespread shortages forced reorganization of urban life and provincial administration. Though Justinian survived, the empire never fully recovered from the plague's shockwaves. External threats compounded internal disasters. In the Balkans, Slavic tribes and Avars pressed against the northern borders, while military resources remained tied up in Italy and North Africa, further strained by disease. Byzantine control weakened, fortresses fell, and raiding parties penetrated deep into imperial territory. In the east, tensions with the Sassanid Persians flared once more. Though a temporary peace had been arranged earlier, it eventually collapsed. Under Khosrow I, Persia launched aggressive campaigns into Byzantine-held Syria and Armenia. The empire, already strained by plague and northern pressure, now faced a costly two-front conflict. After Justinian's death in 565, his nephew Justin II ascended the throne. Lacking political foresight and surrounded by instability, Justin II struggled to manage the empire's fragility. He refused to continue paying tribute to Persia, a policy that had maintained peace, provoking renewed war. His mental health reportedly declined amid constant defeats, leading him to withdraw from governance and appoint Tiberius as Caesar and co-emperor. Tiberius II ruled from the late 570s until his death in 582, a capable administrator. He attempted to stabilize the empire, but the problems he inherited were deeply entrenched. The Avars and Slavs continued raids into the Balkans, reaching the Greek heartlands, while Persians maintained pressure on the eastern frontier. When Maurice became emperor in 582, he brought military expertise and determination. He reorganized the army and launched campaigns that temporarily restored Byzantine authority in the Balkans. He also negotiated peace with Persia, granting the empire temporary respite in the east. However, Maurice's reign ended in tragedy. Seeking to reduce military expenses, he ordered troops to winter beyond the Danube, far from home. Exhausted and angered, the army mutinied. In the year 626, Maurice was overthrown and executed along with his family. A centurion named Phocas seized the throne, initiating one of the most brutal and unstable periods in Byzantine political history. Phocas was widely regarded as a usurper and tyrant. His reign unleashed waves of purges and violence across Constantinople. More critically, it shattered the fragile peace with Persia. Khosrow II, now ruling Persia, claimed he was avenging the murdered Maurice and used the emperor's death as a pretext for war. Persian forces launched an unprecedented assault on Byzantine territories, sweeping through Mesopotamia, Syria, and eventually into Asia Minor itself. During this period, major cities such as Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria fell under Persian control. The loss of Jerusalem carried profound symbolic and religious consequences, as the city held immense significance for Christians throughout the empire. According to Byzantine sources, the Persians even seized the True Cross, one of Christianity's most revered relics. the empire now faced near collapse. The Balkans were effectively lost to Slavic migration and Avar raids. The east had been overrun by Persia. Italy, still recovering from earlier Gothic wars, lay in disarray. The treasury was depleted, and the capital itself faced direct threat. In this moment of crisis, a new figure emerged: Heraclius. Heraclius was the son of the Exarch of Carthage, an imperial governor with considerable autonomy in North Africa. In 610, Heraclius launched a naval expedition against Constantinople, deposed Phocas, and claimed the imperial throne. The situation he inherited was dire, but Heraclius would lead one of the most remarkable comebacks in imperial history. His early years on the throne focused on reorganizing the state. He overhauled the military, introduced new administrative systems, and personally led campaigns against the Persians. By employing mobile tactics and striking deep into Persian territory, Heraclius shifted the momentum of the war. In a series of campaigns between 622 and 628, he defeated multiple Persian armies and even captured the Persian capital. In the aftermath, Khosrow II was overthrown by his own generals, and a new peace was established. The Byzantines regained Jerusalem, recovered many lost provinces, and restored the True Cross to the Holy City. After nearly 2 decades of catastrophic war, the Eastern Roman Empire had survived, achieving a stunning military victory. Yet the cost was immense. The empire was exhausted. Cities lay in ruins. Agricultural lands had been ravaged, and the population depleted by war and plague. Trade routes were disrupted, and local economies across the eastern provinces were in crisis. Heraclius had saved the empire but pushed it to its absolute limits. When Heraclius seized the throne in 610, the empire teetered on the edge of collapse. Syria, Palestine, and Egypt had fallen to the Persians. The Avars and Slavs continued raiding the Balkans, and the treasury had been nearly emptied by decades of war and internal instability. Yet despite this bleak landscape, Heraclius led one of the most astonishing military and political recoveries in Roman history. But his triumphs, as impressive as they were, would soon be overshadowed by a new force emerging from the Arabian Peninsula. Heraclius was born in the late 6th century in Cappadocia, in what is now central Turkey. His father governed Byzantine North Africa from Carthage as the Exarch. After the empire descended into chaos under Phocas, Heraclius launched a naval expedition from Carthage and deposed the tyrant. Entering Constantinople, he was proclaimed emperor, inheriting a fragmented, battered state under siege. In the first years of his rule, Heraclius focused on reorganizing the empire's institutions. He reduced expenditures, curtailed court extravagance, and introduced administrative reforms to stabilize the treasury. He restructured the military by developing the theme system, granting land to soldiers in exchange for hereditary service. Though its full influence came later, the foundations of this system trace back to Heraclius's reign. By the early 620s, Heraclius turned back to the Eastern Front. The Sassanid Persians under Khosrow II had penetrated deep into Byzantine territory. Jerusalem fell in 614, followed by Alexandria. The True Cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, was carried off to Persia, and morale across the empire plummeted. Heraclius, however, refused to concede defeat. In a bold and risky strategy, he launched campaigns between 622 and 628, striking deep into Persian lands. Rather than merely defending his provinces, he attacked the Persian heartland directly, forcing Khosrow to divert forces from conquered territories. In one of Byzantine history's most celebrated victories, Heraclius defeated the Persians at the Battle of Nineveh in 627. Soon after, he advanced on Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. Khosrow II was overthrown and executed by his generals, and his son, Kavad II, sued for peace. The Byzantines recovered Jerusalem, reclaimed many eastern provinces, and restored the True Cross. In Constantinople, Heraclius was hailed as a second Constantine. Church bells rang, triumphal processions filled the streets, and the emperor personally returned the true cross to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. After nearly 2 decades of brutal warfare, the empire not only survived but regained much of its former strength. Yet the cost was staggering. Eastern provinces were devastated, the countryside depopulated, cities lay in ruins, and local economies collapsed. The empire had exhausted manpower, finances, and morale. While Heraclius had won the war, the empire remained vulnerable. At this moment, a new threat arose from the south. In the Arabian Peninsula, a religious movement had emerged under the Prophet Muhammad. By 632, the tribes of Arabia were unified under Islam. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, launched campaigns beyond Arabia, driven by religious zeal and the opportunity to challenge weakened northern empires. By the mid-630s, Muslim forces began penetrating Byzantine-held Syria. The Byzantines, still recovering from war and plague, were ill prepared. The first major clash occurred at the Battle of Ajnadain in 634, where Byzantine forces were decisively defeated. Heraclius, now in his 60s and increasingly ill, attempted to rally resistance. He relocated the imperial court to Antioch and coordinated defense across the eastern provinces. Yet many local populations, particularly in Egypt and Syria, were disillusioned with imperial rule. Religious divisions, especially over Christ's nature, alienated large segments of the Christian population. These internal fractures proved costly. In 636, the decisive Battle of Yarmouk occurred near the Yarmouk River in modern Jordan. Byzantine forces, led by General Vahan, faced a smaller, more mobile Muslim army commanded by Khalid ibn al-Walid. After days of intense fighting, the Byzantines were routed. The loss was catastrophic. Following Yarmouk, Muslim forces advanced rapidly through Syria and Palestine. Damascus fell, followed by Jerusalem in 637. Umar ibn al-Khattab reportedly entered the city peacefully, protecting Christian holy sites under the terms of surrender. Heraclius had hoped to counterattack, but the empire lacked resources to reclaim the region. He withdrew to Constantinople, reportedly lamenting, "Farewell, Syria." It was a symbolic acknowledgement of the loss of one of the empire's oldest and most vital provinces. Antioch, once a jewel of Roman Syria, was gone. The Holy Land, including Jerusalem, fell under new rule. Egypt followed soon after. Between 640 and 642, Muslim forces advanced through the Nile Delta. Byzantine resistance was sporadic and uncoordinated. Alexandria, the empire's second city and a major center of trade and learning, surrendered after a brief siege. With its loss, the empire was cut off from one of its richest provinces, historically the granary of Rome. By Heraclius's death in 641, the Eastern Roman Empire had suffered one of its most rapid and profound territorial losses. Within a single decade, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and parts of Mesopotamia, all long-standing Roman provinces, were lost. Yet the empire endured. Constantinople remained intact, and Asia Minor, the Balkans, and parts of Armenia stayed under imperial control. Heraclius had reorganized the military in ways that would help future emperors defend the remaining core of the empire. Culturally and religiously, his reign marked a transition. Greek became the empire's primary administrative language, further distancing the Eastern Roman identity from its Latin roots. Heraclius also attempted to heal religious divisions through monothelitism, seeking reconciliation between Chalcedonian and Monophysite factions. This effort largely failed, stirring further controversy. Heraclius remains a complex figure in Byzantine history. A brilliant strategist, he rescued the empire from collapse during the Persian Wars. Yet his triumph coincided with the emergence of an even more devastating challenge. His reign marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now divided. A new Islamic empire was rising, and Byzantium would have to adapt to survive in its shadow. By the mid-7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had been transformed. Weakened by decades of Persian warfare, ravaged by plague and fractured internally, it now faced a rising power from an unexpected direction. the Islamic Caliphate. What began as a series of raids from the Arabian Peninsula quickly became one of the most dramatic military expansions in world history. Following Muhammad's death in 632, the Islamic community, or Ummah, unified under a new political and religious leader, the Caliph. Abu Bakr, the first Caliph, continued expansion initiated during Muhammad's lifetime. His successor, Umar ibn al-Khattab, oversaw the remarkable conquests that followed. The Muslim armies were fast-moving, coordinated and driven by religious fervor and tribal unity. Yet, their success also relied on the vulnerability of the two great northern empires, Byzantium and Persia, both deeply weakened. Persia, in particular, collapsed under the strain, and the Sassanid dynasty disintegrated by mid-century, its lands absorbed by the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. The Byzantines, though still intact, were forced onto the defensive. Syria, Palestine, Egypt and Mesopotamia had already been lost under Heraclius, but the Caliphate pressed onward. Under Caliph Umar and later Caliph Ali, Muslim forces solidified control of the eastern Mediterranean coast and advanced deeper into North Africa and Armenia. The Byzantines attempted to defend what remained. Emperor Constans II, who reigned from the early to late 600s, focused on reorganizing the military. He recognized that the old system, based on fixed provinces and long-distance administration, was no longer sustainable. In response, he formalized the theme system, a territorial and military restructuring that grouped land into military districts. Each theme was governed by a strategos, a military commander responsible for both civil and military administration. This system allowed for faster mobilization and more effective local defense, particularly in Asia Minor. Though it would evolve over time, the theme system remained central to Byzantine governance for centuries. It marked a decisive shift from the traditional Roman imperial model toward a more localized and militarized structure. Despite these reforms, the military situation remained precarious. In 654, the first Arab fleet, created under Caliph Muawiyah, launched naval raids against Cyprus and other parts of Egypt. The Byzantine navy, formidable as it was, now faced a determined and growing maritime rival. Then came the Great Siege. In 674, under the Umayyad Caliphate led by Muawiyah, Arab forces began a sustained assault on Constantinople itself. For several years, they besieged the city during the warmer months, withdrawing each winter. The situation was critical. If Constantinople fell, the empire would almost certainly collapse. But the city, protected by its massive Theodosian walls and strategic location, held firm. The Byzantines also deployed a secret weapon, Greek fire. This incendiary substance, whose precise composition remains unknown, could burn even on water and was projected from siphon-like devices mounted on ships. Greek fire devastated the Arab fleet and played a pivotal role in lifting the siege in 678. The successful defense of Constantinople was a turning point. It did not reverse the empire's losses, but it prevented total collapse. It also carried symbolic weight. The Christian empire had withstood the armies of Islam, preserving its capital and religious identity. Following the failed siege, a 30-year truce was negotiated. This breathing space allowed Emperor Constantine IV to rebuild defenses and continue internal reforms. However, the truce was only temporary. In the meantime, the Islamic Caliphate continued its westward expansion across North Africa. Carthage, once a vital Byzantine stronghold in the Exarchate of Africa, fell in the late 7th century. From there, Muslim forces would eventually cross into the Iberian Peninsula, reshaping Western Europe. In the east, Muslim presence solidified in Armenia and the Caucasus. The border between the Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire hardened into a militarized frontier, often called the Thugger, where raids, skirmishes, and small wars became a way of life for generations. The 7th century also saw significant internal changes within the empire. Greek, long dominant in the eastern provinces, fully replaced Latin in administration. Under Emperor Heraclius, official documents had already begun to be issued in Greek. This linguistic shift reinforced the growing cultural divergence from the old Roman world. The empire still called itself Roman, but the Greek character of its bureaucracy, religion, and society was increasingly pronounced. Religiously, the empire was under strain. The Monothelite doctrine, an attempt to reconcile the Chalcedonian and Monophysite factions by asserting that Christ had two natures but only one will, failed to unify Christian opinion. Many Christians in Egypt, Syria, and Armenia remained alienated from Constantinople. These divisions weakened internal cohesion and contributed to the population's willingness to accept new rulers when Arab armies arrived. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate was preparing for a second attempt to capture Constantinople. In 717, during Emperor Leo III's reign, a massive Arab force launched another siege on the city. The threat was greater than before. The Caliphate brought a large fleet and army, hoping to finish what had begun nearly 50 years earlier. Once again, Constantinople's defenses held. Greek fire, formidable fortifications, and a well-organized defense repelled the attackers. A harsh winter and successful disruption of Arab supply lines also contributed to the siege's failure. After nearly a year, the Arab forces withdrew. This victory marked the end of large-scale Arab attempts to conquer Constantinople. Following the second failed siege, the tide gradually shifted in Byzantium's favor. The empire remained smaller than it had once been, but had adapted. The military and administrative reforms of the 7th century had created a more flexible, resilient state. The Islamic Caliphate, too, faced internal problems. Civil wars, succession disputes, and regional divisions slowed the pace of expansion. By the mid-8th century, the Byzantine Empire had survived the most aggressive phase of the Arab conquests. It had lost vast territories but retained its capital, religious institutions, and identity. By the early 8th century, Byzantium had stabilized its frontiers and withstood the most intense waves of Arab expansion. Its defenses held firm during sieges, and the theme system provided a durable administrative and military structure. Yet, the next great challenge would not come from external invaders, but from within, a spiritual crisis shaking Byzantine religious life and imperial authority, the age of iconoclasm. The word iconoclasm comes from the Greek for image breaking. At its heart, the controversy was a theological and political debate over the proper role of religious images or icons in Christian worship. For centuries, Christians venerated painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. Icons were displayed in churches, homes, and public spaces, and were central to devotion and liturgy. In the early 8th century, a dramatic shift occurred. In 726, Emperor Leo III issued an imperial edict banning the veneration of icons, officially beginning the first phase of Byzantine iconoclasm. The reasons behind Leo's decision remain debated. Some argue it was influenced by the rise of Islam, which forbade human depictions in religious art. Others suggest that military defeats and natural disasters were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, with idol worship blamed. It may also have been a move to assert imperial authority over the church and limit monastic power, as monasteries were strongholds of icon veneration. Whatever the motivations, Leo's decree triggered fierce resistance, particularly from monks, clergy, and lay people who saw icons as essential to faith. Riots erupted in some regions, monasteries were attacked, churches stripped of images, and prominent opponents exiled or executed. Leo's son, Constantine V, succeeded him in 741 and became one of iconoclasm's most forceful advocates. Under his reign, the policy became systematic. A church council held at Hieria in 754 condemned the veneration of icons as heresy and endorsed the emperor's position. Constantine V aggressively suppressed opposition. Monks, who often led the defense of icons, suffered the most. Monasteries were closed, many monks imprisoned, tortured, or forcibly secularized. Religious art depicting holy figures was replaced with ornamental or symbolic decoration. Imperial propaganda portrayed iconoclasts as defenders of pure Christianity, linking their cause to military success and divine favor. Despite official pressure, icon veneration persisted privately and in parts of the church hierarchy. The Western Christian world, especially the papacy in Rome, rejected iconoclasm, contributing to tensions between Constantinople and the Latin West, already strained by cultural and political differences. The first phase of iconoclasm continued until the death of Constantine V's son, Leo IV, in 780. His widow, Empress Irene, acted as regent for their young son. Constantine sick and reversed iconoclastic policies. Irene convened the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, affirming the veneration of icons as Orthodox practice. This council is recognized as the Seventh Ecumenical Council by both Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Irene's actions ended the first iconoclastic period, but stirred controversy. As a woman wielding imperial authority in a patriarchal society, she faced challenges. She eventually had her son blinded and assumed sole control of the empire. Though she maintained the restoration of icons, her reign was marked by instability. The second wave of iconoclasm began in the early 9th century under Leo V. Citing military defeats as divine punishment, Leo reinstated iconoclasm in 815. This second phase was less violent than the first, but still led to persecution of iconophiles, those who supported icon veneration. Leo V was assassinated in 820, but iconoclasm persisted under his successors. It was not until Empress Theodora, regent for her son Michael III, that iconoclasm ended. In 843, Theodora formally restored icon veneration, marking the triumph of orthodoxy, still celebrated annually in the Eastern Orthodox Church. The end of iconoclasm resolved a theological dispute and reaffirmed the role of images in Byzantine religious life. It strengthened the monastic movement, which resisted imperial interference in spiritual matters. Monasteries became even more influential, producing theological texts, preserving manuscripts, and shaping public piety. Politically, the iconoclastic controversy had weakened the empire. Harsh suppression created internal divisions, and alienation of the Western Church widened the cultural and religious gulf with Rome. Resources devoted to internal conflict distracted the empire from external threats. During iconoclasm, Arab raids continued along the frontiers, and Sicily faced increasing Muslim pressure. The empire's Mediterranean position gradually eroded, and the Bulgars to the north became a more organized and threatening force. The final end of iconoclasm in 843 marked more than theological resolution. It set the stage for political and cultural transformation. Emerging from over a century of religious upheaval, Byzantium entered a period of consolidation and renewed strength. This new direction took shape under the leadership of one of its most unlikely emperors, Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty. Basil's rise to power stands as one of the most remarkable personal stories in Byzantine history. Born into a peasant family in the theme of Macedonia, which lay in Thrace rather than the modern region of Macedonia, Basil was of Armenian descent. Orphaned at an early age, he reportedly worked as a stable hand before being noticed for his physical strength and intelligence. He eventually made his way to Constantinople, entering the imperial court and gaining favor through a mix of charisma, ambition, and calculated loyalty. By the middle of the 9th century, Basil had become a prominent figure at court. He entered the service of Emperor Michael III, the last ruler of the Amorian dynasty, and rose quickly through the ranks. His relationship with the emperor was unusually close. Basil was named co-emperor in 866, a move that shocked many in the imperial establishment. Only a year later, in 867, Michael III was assassinated, and Basil became sole emperor. Whether he was directly involved in the assassination remains debated, but his swift assumption of power demonstrated his political acumen. Once in power, Basil I set out to strengthen imperial institutions, restore the throne's prestige, and consolidate gains made since the end of iconoclasm. Though he had little formal education, he was deeply committed to reviving the classical and legal traditions of the empire. One of his major projects was the reform and codification of Byzantine law. He commissioned a new legal compilation known as the Basilica, a Greek revision and expansion of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. This legal code, written in the vernacular Greek of the time, made the law more accessible and served as a foundation for Byzantine jurisprudence for centuries. Basil also worked to improve the efficiency of the imperial bureaucracy. He reorganized administrative structures, reduced corruption, and placed capable individuals in key positions. While earlier emperors had often relied on court favorites or aristocrats, Basil promoted officials based on merit. This allowed for more effective governance and helped restore public confidence in the imperial system. Religiously, Basil maintained the Orthodox consensus established after iconoclasm. He supported the power of the Church, particularly the monastic movement, which had become a cultural and spiritual force. Monasteries expanded their influence during his reign, contributing to education, art, and theology. Basil also supported missionary activity beyond the empire's borders, particularly among the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. One of the most lasting achievements of this work was the conversion of the Bulgarians to Christianity. Though the process had begun under earlier emperors, it was under Basil's rule that Christianization became firmly rooted. Byzantine missionaries helped establish a native Slavic clergy and promoted the use of the Glagolitic and Cyrillic alphabets developed by Saints Cyril and Methodius, profoundly influencing Slavic culture and literacy. Militarily, Basil's reign was marked by defensive consolidation and targeted expansion. He inherited a stable frontier thanks to earlier emperors and used this security to fortify key border regions. In the east, he launched campaigns against Arab forces in Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, achieving limited successes. In the west, he reasserted control over southern Italy, where Byzantine authority had been eroding under Arab and Frankish pressure. Naval strength was also a priority. The Byzantine fleet remained crucial for imperial defense, particularly in the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. While Basil did not personally lead major naval campaigns, he ensured maritime defenses were well maintained, deterring large-scale Arab raids on the coasts. Despite these achievements, Basil faced challenges. His legitimacy was questioned due to the circumstances of his rise. The memory of Michael III lingered, and some viewed Basil as a usurper. Over time, however, his administrative successes and public image helped secure his place as a legitimate and respected ruler. Basil was known for personal austerity and devotion to justice. He styled himself as a new David, a humble and righteous ruler chosen by God. This image contrasted him with the perceived decadence and moral failures of the Amorian dynasty, presenting him as a restorer of order and tradition, resonating with both aristocracy and common people. One area of less success was dynastic succession. Basil had several sons, but the legitimacy of his eldest, Leo, was complicated by rumors that he was not Basil's biological child, but rather Michael III's son. Despite doubts, Basil named Leo co-emperor in 869 to secure the dynasty's future. Their relationship was strained. Basil reportedly distrusted Leo and even imprisoned him temporarily. Nonetheless, Leo eventually succeeded as Emperor Leo VI, the Wise. The tension between father and son reflected broader Byzantine dynastic challenges, where legitimacy, loyalty, and lineage were constantly contested. When Basil died in 886, he left a revitalized empire. The state was more centralized, the law more coherent, the church more unified, and the frontiers secure. His reign marked the beginning of the Macedonian dynasty, which would rule Byzantium for nearly 2 centuries and preside over one of its most stable and culturally vibrant eras. Under his successors, the empire entered a period often called the Macedonian Renaissance. Learning, literature, and the arts flourished, while military and political power steadily expanded. Basil's improbable rise from peasant origins to emperor set the foundation for an era in which Byzantium, no longer consumed by internal division or immediate existential threats, could project power, revive classical learning, and play a central role in medieval politics. The accession of Basil I in the late 9th century marked the Macedonian dynasty's start and a profound revival of Byzantine power, culture, and learning. Over the next century, the empire stabilized and consolidated territorial control while experiencing a cultural flourishing known as the Macedonian Renaissance. This revival was a deliberate return to classical ideals, administrative reform, religious unity, and artistic expression. Building on Basil I's foundation, his successors refined governance, improved military structures, and promoted study of ancient texts, projecting Byzantine influence beyond traditional borders. After Basil's death in 886, his son Leo VI the Wise ascended. A scholar and lawgiver, Leo defined the era's intellectual spirit. He authored works on military strategy, religious doctrine, and court ceremony, and revised and expanded his father's legal code, producing the Basilica, a major codification of Roman law in Greek, adapted for contemporary Byzantine society. Leo also strengthened the emperor's secular and religious authority, intervening in ecclesiastical matters, defining church policy, and emphasizing Constantinople's centrality in Orthodox Christianity. Leo's personal life sparked controversy. Seeking a male heir, he married 4 times, violating church canons, which led to conflict with Patriarch Nicholas Mystikos and highlighted the delicate balance between imperial power and religious tradition. Despite this, his reign was largely peaceful and marked by internal consolidation. His patronage preserved and copied classical Greek texts, many of which might otherwise have been lost. Scriptoria in monasteries and urban centers flourished, blending classical learning with Christian theology, giving the Macedonian period its intellectual richness. Leo was succeeded by his brother Alexander, whose brief, ineffective reign was followed by a regency for Leo's young son, Constantine VII. Initially sidelined by generals and court factions, Constantine eventually assumed full control, reigning from the early to mid-10th century. Known as Constantine Porphyrogenitus, or born in the purple, he upheld imperial tradition and ceremonial grandeur. His court became a hub of learning and artistic patronage. He authored and commissioned key works, including De Administrando Imperio, a guide to ruling and diplomacy, detailing customs, geography, and politics of neighboring peoples. This text shows the empire's self-awareness and complex relationships with Slavs, Bulgars, Arabs, and Franks. Another work, De Ceremoniis, detailed imperial rituals and court etiquette, reinforcing the emperor's sacred status and the court's theatrical splendor. These texts remain invaluable for understanding medieval Byzantine governance and diplomacy. Culturally, the visual arts flourished under Constantine and his successors. Mosaics, manuscripts, ivory carvings, and church architecture saw renewed attention. Churches, like Hagia Sophia, were refurbished, emphasizing divine order and imperial authority. These works combined theological meaning with aesthetic sophistication, reflecting the confidence of an empire seeing itself again as the center of civilization. Militarily, the 10th century was one of offensive expansion. Long-standing enemies, including Arab Emirates in eastern Anatolia and northern Syria, were on the defensive. Byzantine armies, led by capable generals like John Corcuus and Nikephoros Phocas, launched systematic campaigns to recover lost territory. Under Romanos Theonolecapenos, a naval officer who became co-emperor during Constantine's minority, the empire gained ground in the east, culminating in the reconquest of key cities such as Melitene and Edessa. These victories restored prestige and reopened trade and pilgrimage routes to the Holy Land. Expansion continued under Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas, who became emperor in the latter half of the 10th century. He reconquered Crete from Arab pirates in 961, securing the eastern Mediterranean. He also campaigned successfully in Syria, capturing Aleppo and extending Byzantine control deeper into the Levant. Nikephoros reformed the army, emphasized cavalry, and promoted heavily armed infantry. His military manuals, like the Precepta Militaria, reveal the era's strategic thinking and influenced military doctrine for generations. Despite success, he faced court opposition. His austerity and strict fiscal policies angered aristocrats and church leaders. He was eventually assassinated in a palace coup led by John Tzimiskis in 969. John Tzimiskis continued eastern expansion, campaigning deep into Mesopotamia and securing victories against Arab and Bulgar forces. He balanced military success with internal harmony, reconciling court factions and easing tensions with the church. The reigns of these warrior emperors exemplified the Macedonian Renaissance. The empire was not merely defending itself, it was expanding, reforming, and asserting cultural leadership. Boundaries grew, cities prospered, and institutions matured. Diplomatically, Byzantium wielded influence through marriage alliances with Kievan Rus and Armenia, and Christian missions reached Eastern Europe. The conversion of the Rus under Prince Vladimir of Kiev in the late 10th century was guided by Byzantine clergy and liturgical practice. The use of the Cyrillic script and Orthodox theology helped form the cultural foundation of Eastern Slavic Christianity. In the West, the empire remained wary of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly under Otto I. Despite occasional tensions, Byzantium maintained its claim as the legitimate Roman Empire and acted as a central authority in the Christian world, even as the Latin West asserted independence. By the end of the 10th century, the Macedonian dynasty had brought Byzantium to new heights. Politically stable, territorially secure, culturally vibrant, and diplomatically influential, Constantinople stood as the largest and most magnificent Christian city, a beacon of wealth, order, and tradition. The Macedonian Renaissance was not mere imitation of the past, but a confident expression of a unique Byzantine identity, Roman, Orthodox, imperial, and sacred. By the final quarter of the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire had reached a level of strength, territorial control, and cultural refinement unmatched in centuries. Under Emperor Basil II, the empire would achieve its greatest military power and internal stability, reaching what many consider the apex of the Eastern Roman state. Basil II was born in 957 to Emperor Romanos II and Theophano. He was still a child when his father died, and during his early years real power was exercised by regents, including the military emperors Nikephoros Teku, Phocas, and John Tzimiskis. These warrior rulers preserved the empire's military momentum, but their deaths left young Basil at the mercy of the court elite, particularly the powerful Lekepenos family, who acted as de facto rulers during the early part of his reign. When Basil officially became senior emperor in 976, he faced a situation far more precarious than it appeared. Though the empire was vast and prosperous, the emperor's central authority had been weakened by the growing power of the landed aristocracy. In provinces such as Anatolia and Armenia, wealthy families, many of military origin, controlled enormous estates and private armies. These magnates presented a quiet but serious challenge to imperial authority. From the outset of his reign, Basil II aimed to restore absolute control. His first major challenge was an internal rebellion led by Bardas Skleros, a powerful general who claimed the throne and rallied support in the eastern provinces. The rebellion lasted several years, gaining significant momentum, before Basil crushed it with the support of loyal forces, including the foreign mercenary unit known as the Varangian Guard. Soon after, a second and even more dangerous rebellion arose, led by Bardas Phocas, a member of the influential Phocas family and nephew of the former emperor Nikephoros II. This revolt drew upon widespread aristocratic discontent and nearly split the empire. Basil, however, proved determined and ruthless. After years of conflict, Bardas Phocas was defeated and killed in battle, and Basil moved decisively to dismantle the political power of the great landowning families. His victories over these internal threats marked a turning point. For the first time in generations, the emperor reasserted direct control over the provinces. Basil implemented tax reforms to reclaim state revenues lost to private landholders and reinforced imperial authority over regional governors. These measures did not end aristocratic influence but curtailed its political ambitions, allowing Basil to centralize administration. With domestic power secured, Basil turned to foreign policy, focusing on the long-standing conflict with the Bulgarians. The Bulgarian Empire, north of the Byzantine Balkans, had been a persistent threat to Constantinople for centuries. During the 9th and early 10th centuries under Tsar Simeon and his successors, the Bulgarians had seriously challenged Byzantine control. Relations had been tense, and previous emperors had failed to subdue the region. Basil II was determined to change this. What followed were campaigns spanning over 2 decades, as Basil waged relentless war against Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria. The terrain was harsh and Bulgarian resistance fierce. Rather than a single decisive battle, the conflict consisted of sieges, skirmishes, and gradual attrition. Despite early setbacks, including a major defeat at the gates of Trajan, Basil slowly gained the upper hand. He reorganized the army, strengthened supply lines, and ensured discipline among his troops. His persistence and strategy eventually paid off. In 1001, Basil captured the Bulgarian capital of Ohrid. Over the following years, he methodically reduced Bulgarian fortresses one by one. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Clydian, where Basil trapped and annihilated a large Bulgarian army. According to later Byzantine sources, he ordered thousands of prisoners to be blinded, leaving 1 in every 100 with a single eye to lead the rest home. When Tsar Samuel saw his returning mutilated soldiers, he reportedly died of shock. Though the story may be exaggerated, the battle's effect was undeniable. Bulgarian resistance collapsed, and by 1018 the entire Bulgarian Empire was annexed into Byzantium. Basil earned the epithet Bulgar Slayer, or Bulgaroktonos, for this conquest. This victory removed a long-standing rival and extended Byzantine authority deep into the Balkans. It allowed the integration of Bulgarian territory, administration, and population into the imperial system. The annexation brought new revenue, manpower, and secured Byzantium's northern frontier for a generation. Basil also campaigned in the east, reasserting influence over parts of Armenia and Georgia through a mix of military action and diplomatic marriage. His goal was expansion and the stabilization of the empire's eastern borderlands, where rival powers and tribal confederations frequently disrupted trade and security. Throughout his reign, Basil maintained a strong personal grip on the army. He spent most of his time on campaign rather than in Constantinople, earning the loyalty of his soldiers and ensuring the army remained under imperial, not aristocratic, control. Unlike many predecessors, Basil avoided luxury and court extravagance, lived simply, took no wife, and fathered no children. His focus was the state, which he ruled with discipline and resolve. Basil's reign coincided with continued cultural growth from the Macedonian Renaissance. Though not a scholar like Constantine VII, he patronized church construction, manuscript preservation, and monastic life. He supported the Orthodox Church and maintained religious orthodoxy, continuing the legacy of doctrinal clarity established after iconoclasm. By the time of his death in 1025, Basil II had ruled for nearly 5 decades. His reign was the longest of any Byzantine emperor and one of the most consequential. The empire stretched from the Adriatic Sea in the west to the Euphrates in the east, and from the Danube in the north to the Mediterranean in the south. Internal stability, fiscal health, and military dominance defined the state he left behind. Yet this very strength masked emerging vulnerabilities. Basil's centralization meant his successors inherited an empire highly dependent on his personal authority. With no direct heir, the throne passed to his brother Constantine VIII, an aging and politically inexperienced man. The discipline and unity of Basil's reign would not be maintained. The death of Basil's sect in 1025 left Byzantium at the height of territorial expansion and internal stability. Beneath this strength, however, lay a structural vulnerability, the absence of a clear and capable successor. Basil's long reign ensured continuity, discipline, and central authority, but his failure to marry or produce heirs left a vacuum that quickly destabilized the empire. The throne passed to Constantine VIII, a man in his 60s with little interest in governance. Unlike Basil, he had spent most of his life indulging in courtly pleasures rather than military or administrative affairs. Though nominally co-emperor during Basil's reign, he had played no real role in policy. As sole emperor, his rule was marked by complacency and lack of vision. Constantine ruled only a few years before dying in 1028 to secure succession. He arranged the marriage of his daughter Zoe to Romanos Argyros, a noble of distinguished background, who became Emperor Romanos III. This began a pattern where emperors came to power through marriage or political maneuvering rather than inheritance or conquest. Zoe and her sister Theodora became central figures in Byzantine politics during this period. Though women were formally excluded from military or administrative office, empresses wielded immense influence through court alliances and dynastic arrangements. Zoe's personal life, with multiple marriages and dramatic palace intrigues, symbolized mid-11th century imperial instability. Romanos III, Zoe's first husband, attempted to continue strong leadership. He launched military campaigns in the east, particularly against Muslim emirates in Syria, but results were mixed. In 1030, his army suffered a humiliating defeat at Azaz, returning to Constantinople with diminished prestige. His economic policies failed to curb aristocratic influence, which was reclaiming land and weakening state finances. Romanos's relationship with Zoe deteriorated, and in 1034 he died under suspicious circumstances. Zoe then married her chamberlain, Michael IV. Though his reign was brief, he introduced some reforms and military action, but real power lay with his brother, John the Orphan Atrophus, who dominated administration. Michael IV faced renewed conflict with Bulgaria, recently annexed under Basil II, a large-scale revolt in the early 1040s. Led by Peter Delian, tested Byzantine control in the Balkans but was ultimately suppressed, highlighting limits of imperial authority outside Constantinople. Michael II died in 1041 and was succeeded by his nephew, Michael V, a ruler with ambition but little support. In a shocking move, he exiled Empress Zoe, sparking a popular uprising. The people stormed the palace, restoring Zoe to the throne alongside her sister, Theodora. For a brief period, the empire was jointly ruled by two empresses, an extraordinary moment in Byzantine history. Eventually, Zoe married a third time to Constantine Monomachos. His long reign brought temporary stability, but deeper problems remained. Constantine focused on patronage, luxury, and theological disputes rather than military readiness or economic reform. During his reign, the Byzantine navy was neglected, the army slowly declined, and mercenary forces increasingly replaced professional troops. Strategic provinces were left vulnerable. Meanwhile, tensions with the Latin West escalated. In 1054, the formal split between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches occurred, the Great Schism. Though doctrinal differences had existed for centuries, mutual excommunications by the Patriarch of Constantinople and the papal legate formalized the divide. This rupture weakened Byzantine relations with Western powers just as new threats emerged from the East. Perhaps the most serious of these threats was the rise of the Seljuk Turks. Originating in Central Asia, they converted to Islam and quickly became a dominant force in Persia and the Eastern Islamic world. By the mid-11th century, they began pressing into Byzantine Anatolia, challenging imperial authority in the empire's military and economic heartland. The Byzantine response to the Seljuks was inconsistent. The once formidable military apparatus had weakened. Internal court politics often overshadowed strategic planning, and reliance on foreign mercenaries eroded army effectiveness. In this context, the throne passed to Romanos IV of Diogenes in 1068. A soldier by background, Romanos sought to reverse decline through military reform and a major campaign against the Seljuks. His efforts culminated in one of Byzantium's most disastrous events, the Battle of
Manzikert in Tintarodzibidis near Lake Van in eastern
Anatolia. The battle pitted the Byzantine army against the Seljuk forces under Sultan Alp Arslan. Romanos led a large force into hostile territory, hoping to halt the Turkish advance and reassert imperial strength. But the campaign was poorly coordinated. Disunity among commanders, betrayal by key allies, and logistical failures weakened the army. During the battle, forces led by Andronikos Doukas, a rival faction, abandoned the field. This allowed the Seljuks to encircle and defeat the Byzantines. Romanos was captured by Alp Arslan, who reportedly treated him with courtesy and released him after negotiating terms. Despite his release, Romanos returned to Constantinople to a hostile political climate. He was quickly overthrown, blinded and exiled. His defeat at Manzikert unleashed chaos in Anatolia. The loss was not merely military, it marked the beginning of a large-scale Turkish migration into Byzantine territory. Within years, vast areas of Asia Minor fell under Turkish control. Manzikert exposed the fragility of Byzantium in the face of internal division and external threats. What Basil II had built, the disciplined, centralized empire, was unraveling. Factionalism, military weakness, and dynastic instability replaced the order he had established. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 was one of the most devastating defeats in Byzantine history. It was more than a lost battle. It marked a fundamental shift in the empire's geopolitical position. The aftermath triggered the collapse of Byzantine authority in Anatolia, the empire's core region, opening the way for Turkish expansion into Roman lands. By the time of his death in 1025, Basil II had ruled for nearly 5 decades. His reign was the longest of any Byzantine emperor and one of the most consequential. The empire stretched from the Adriatic Sea in the west to the Euphrates in the east, and from the Danube in the north to the Mediterranean in the south. Internal stability, fiscal health, and military dominance defined the state he left behind. Yet this very strength masked emerging vulnerabilities. Basil's centralization meant his successors inherited an empire highly dependent on his personal authority. With no direct heir, the throne passed to his brother Constantine VIII, an aging and politically inexperienced man. The discipline and unity of Basil's reign would not be maintained. The death of Basil II in 1025 left Byzantium at the height of territorial expansion and internal stability. Beneath this strength, however, lay a structural vulnerability, the absence of a clear and capable successor. Basil's long reign ensured continuity, discipline, and central authority, but his failure to marry or produce heirs left a vacuum that quickly destabilized the empire. The throne passed to Constantine VIII, a man in his 60s with little interest in governance. Unlike Basil, he had spent most of his life indulging in courtly pleasures rather than military or administrative affairs. Though nominally co-emperor during Basil's reign, he had played no real role in policy. As sole emperor, his rule was marked by complacency and lack of vision. Constantine ruled only a few years before dying in 1028 to secure succession. He arranged the marriage of his daughter Zoe to Romanos Argyros, a noble of distinguished background, who became Emperor Romanos III. This began a pattern where emperors came to power through marriage or political maneuvering rather than inheritance or conquest. Zoe and her sister Theodora became central figures in Byzantine politics during this period. Though women were formally excluded from military or administrative office, Empresses wielded immense influence through court alliances and dynastic arrangements. Zoe's personal life, with multiple marriages and dramatic palace intrigues, symbolized mid-11th century imperial instability. Romanos III, Zoe's first husband, attempted to continue strong leadership. He launched military campaigns in the east, particularly against Muslim emirates in Syria, but results were mixed. In 1030, his army suffered a humiliating defeat at Azaz, returning to Constantinople with diminished prestige. His economic policies failed to curb aristocratic influence, which was reclaiming land and weakening state finances. Romanos's relationship with Zoe deteriorated, and in 1034 he died under suspicious circumstances. Zoe then married her chamberlain, Michael IV. Though his reign was brief, he introduced some reforms and military action, but real power lay with his brother, John the Orphanatrophus, who dominated administration. Michael IV faced renewed conflict with Bulgaria, recently annexed under Basil II. A large-scale revolt in the early 1040s, led by Peter Delian, tested Byzantine control in the Balkans but was ultimately suppressed, highlighting limits of imperial authority outside Constantinople. Michael II died in 1041 and was succeeded by his nephew, Michael V, a ruler with ambition but little support. In a shocking move, he exiled Empress Zoe, sparking a popular uprising. The people stormed the palace, restoring Zoe to the throne alongside her sister, Theodora. For a brief period, the empire was jointly ruled by two empresses, an extraordinary moment in Byzantine history. Eventually, Zoe married a third time to Constantine Monomachos. His long reign brought temporary stability, but deeper problems remained. Constantine focused on patronage, luxury, and theological disputes rather than military readiness or economic reform. During his reign, the Byzantine navy was neglected, the army slowly declined, and mercenary forces increasingly replaced professional troops. Strategic provinces were left vulnerable. Meanwhile, tensions with the Latin West escalated. In 1054, the formal split between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches occurred, the Great Schism. Though doctrinal differences had existed for centuries, mutual excommunications by the Patriarch of Constantinople and the papal legate formalized the divide. This rupture weakened Byzantine relations with Western powers just as new threats emerged from the East. Perhaps the most serious of these threats was the rise of the Seljuk Turks. Originating in Central Asia, they converted to Islam and quickly became a dominant force in Persia and the Eastern Islamic world. By the mid-11th century, they began pressing into Byzantine Anatolia, challenging imperial authority in the empire's military and economic heartland. The Byzantine response to the Seljuks was inconsistent. The once formidable military apparatus had weakened. Internal court politics often overshadowed strategic planning, and reliance on foreign mercenaries eroded army effectiveness. In this context, the throne passed to Romanos IV of Diogenes in 1068, a soldier by background. Romanos sought to reverse decline through military reform and a major campaign against the Seljuks. His efforts culminated in one of Byzantium's most disastrous events, the Battle of
Manzikert in 1070s near Lake Van in Eastern
Anatolia. The battle pitted the Byzantine army against the Seljuk forces under Sultan Alp Arslan. Romanos led a large force into hostile territory, hoping to halt the Turkish advance and reassert imperial strength. But the campaign was poorly coordinated. Disunity among commanders, betrayal by key allies, and logistical failures weakened the army. During the battle, forces led by Andronikos Doukas, a rival faction, abandoned the field. This allowed the Seljuks to encircle and defeat the Byzantines. Romanos was captured by Alp Arslan, who reportedly treated him with courtesy and released him after negotiating terms. Despite his release, Romanos returned to Constantinople to a hostile political climate. He was quickly overthrown, blinded and exiled. His defeat at Manzikert unleashed chaos in Anatolia. The loss was not merely military, It marked the beginning of a large-scale Turkish migration into Byzantine territory. Within years, vast areas of Asia Minor fell under Turkish control. Manzikert exposed the fragility of Byzantium in the face of internal division and external threats. What Basil II had built, the disciplined, centralized empire, was unraveling. Factionalism, military weakness, and dynastic instability replaced the order he had established. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 was one of the most devastating defeats in Byzantine history. It was more than a lost battle. It marked a fundamental shift in the empire's geopolitical position. The aftermath triggered the collapse of Byzantine authority in Anatolia, the empire's core region, opening the way for Turkish expansion into Roman lands. The Pope, eager to assert leadership over a unified Christendom and perhaps heal the East-West schism, responded enthusiastically. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban issued a call to arms. The goal, as framed, was to aid Christians of the East and liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. This sparked mass mobilization across Western Europe, the First Crusade. For Alexios, the crusade was both opportunity and risk. He had hoped for small, disciplined forces from the West. But what arrived was a massive, disorganized wave of pilgrims, knights, and opportunists driven by piety, ambition, and desperation. The initial wave, the People's Crusade, led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit, lacked discipline and leadership. They caused chaos in the Balkans, pillaging Byzantine towns and clashing with locals. Alexios, though frustrated, managed to escort them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, where the Turks swiftly annihilated them. The second wave was different. Led by seasoned nobles such as Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and Godfrey of Bouillon, the main crusading armies were better equipped and organized. Upon arrival in Constantinople, Alexios demanded oaths of loyalty and promises that any recovered Byzantine lands would be returned to imperial control. Most leaders agreed, though the sincerity of these pledges would soon be tested. As the Crusaders advanced into Anatolia, they recaptured key cities, including Nicaea, returned to imperial control. Their victories against the Turks reopened parts of Western Asia Minor to Byzantine administration. Encouraged, Alexios cautiously followed behind the Crusaders, re-establishing garrisons and restoring some order. However, tensions escalated. The Crusaders viewed themselves as independent agents of divine mission, not vassals of the emperor. Byzantine officers considered the Westerners unruly, arrogant, and dangerously unpredictable. Mutual suspicions deepened as Crusaders advanced beyond Byzantine interests, pushing into Syria and eventually besieging Antioch and Jerusalem. Though the Crusades achieved remarkable military feats, including the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, their legacy for Byzantium was mixed. On one hand, Alexios had recovered significant territory in Asia Minor, restoring a measure of imperial strength in the region. On the other hand, the Crusaders had established a series of Latin states in the Levant, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch, which operated independently and sometimes directly opposed Byzantine goals. The creation of these Latin states introduced new political complications. Rather than acting as reliable allies, the Crusader lords frequently challenged Byzantine claims to overlordship and operated as rival powers. In particular, Bohemond of Taranto seized Antioch for himself and refused to return it to the empire despite his earlier oath. This betrayal would haunt Byzantine-Latin relations for decades. Alexios responded to these challenges with diplomatic pragmatism. He avoided direct conflict with the Crusader states, but sought to expand Byzantine influence through treaties and strategic marriages. He also focused on rebuilding imperial institutions, reforming the tax system, reviving the currency, and encouraging trade and urban revival. Constantinople once again became a thriving center of commerce, culture, and learning. By the end of his reign, Alexios had restored the empire from the brink of collapse. He had repelled external threats, reasserted control over parts of Anatolia, and restructured the state to confront the changing world. Yet the empire he left to his son, John II Komnenos, was no longer the same as that of Basil II. The Komnenian system relied heavily on family alliances, patronage, and a semi-feudal arrangement with the aristocracy. While this created short-term stability, it tied imperial power to the fortunes of a single family. Additionally, Western involvement in the Eastern Mediterranean had created a new reality in which Byzantium could no longer claim uncontested dominance over Christendom. Still, Alexios had achieved what many thought impossible. He had held the empire together, resisted invasions, and leveraged the First Crusade to his advantage, at least temporarily. His reign marked the beginning of a Komnenian revival that would sustain Byzantium through much of the 12th century. By the time of his death in the early 12th century, he had regained control over key parts of Anatolia, restored imperial order, and reasserted Byzantium's relevance on the global stage. His policies and legacy passed to his son, John II Komnenos, who continued the cautious recovery of territory and prestige. As the Komnenian era progressed, it became clear that the restoration had limits. Despite outward strength and cultural vibrancy, underlying weaknesses began to resurface. John II inherited the throne relatively smoothly, an achievement given the often violent nature of Byzantine successions. His reign, lasting over 2 decades, was marked by consistency, discipline, and a strong sense of imperial duty. Unlike his father, who relied on political intrigue and diplomacy, John was known for austerity, humility, and deep religiosity. Militarily, John II focused on campaigns in Anatolia and the Balkans. He sought to reclaim cities from the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum and secure the Danube frontier from nomadic incursions. His most ambitious efforts were in Cilicia and northern Syria, where he attempted to bring Crusader states under Byzantine influence. Through carefully planned campaigns, he pressured Antioch's leaders to recognize Byzantine overlordship. Though successful in some military and diplomatic efforts, John's ambitions were limited by the constraints of Byzantine power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusader lords were difficult to control, and the growing independence of Western powers made it clear that Byzantium could no longer dictate events in the Levant. Nonetheless, John II's reign restored confidence in the throne, stabilized the eastern frontier, and ushered in a period of relative peace and prosperity. He died unexpectedly during a hunting accident, leaving the throne to his youngest son, Manuel I Komnenos. Known for charisma, energy, and imperial ambition, Manuel embodied the most outwardly confident expression of the Komnenian restoration. His reign was defined by assertive foreign policy, extensive contact with Western Europe, and the expansion of Byzantine influence beyond traditional boundaries. Manuel had been educated in a court influenced by Latin customs and was fascinated by Western chivalry, diplomacy, and warfare. This cultural affinity shaped many of his decisions. He married a Frankish princess, invited Western knights into his armies, and participated in tournaments and courtly displays inspired by Western traditions. At times, he envisioned Byzantium not merely as the heir to Rome, but as the unifying force of Christendom. One of Manuel's most ambitious ventures was in Italy. Seeking to reassert Byzantine claims in the south, he launched campaigns to recover territories formerly under imperial control. Though initially successful, the effort ultimately failed due to strong Norman resistance and logistical challenges of long-distance operations. Even so, the campaign showcased the emperor's expansive vision. In the Balkans, Manuel achieved more tangible success. He maintained dominance over Hungary through war and diplomacy and kept the Serbs and other regional powers in check. His court became a diplomatic hub, hosting ambassadors from across Europe and the Muslim world. Constantinople under Manuel was a dazzling cosmopolitan city, wealthy and full of art, architecture, and scholarship. Yet beneath the grandeur lay growing tensions. Manuel's military ventures strained the treasury. He expanded the army with mercenaries, many Western knights, whose loyalty depended entirely on payment. The traditional theme system, once the backbone of Byzantine defense, had eroded and native recruitment declined sharply. The administration, while sophisticated, relied increasingly on a narrow elite connected to the Komnenian family through marriage and patronage. This concentration of power created a politically insular court, alienating many provincial aristocrats in Asia Minor and the Balkans. While Alexios, John, and Manuel had maintained a careful balance, their successors would struggle to hold it together. Manuel's reign ended with the Battle of Myriokephalon in the late 12th century, where the Byzantines suffered defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. Though not catastrophic, the battle marked the symbolic end of Byzantine ambitions to reclaim Anatolia. The vision of fully reversing Manzikirt's consequences faded. The empire now focused on defending its frontiers rather than expansion. After Manuel's death, the empire entered steady decline. His son, Alexios II, inherited the throne as a child, leaving real power in the hands of regents. The court became a battleground for factions, and palace intrigue once again dominated political life. Byzantium's rivals seized the opportunity. Hungarians, Seljuks, and Sicilian Normans renewed pressure on the borders. In a violent episode, a usurper, Andronikos Komnenos, seized power, promising to purge the corrupt court and restore justice. Initially welcomed for populist rhetoric, he soon revealed himself as a ruthless autocrat. His regime, marked by terror and executions, alienated both aristocracy and common people. He was eventually overthrown and killed in a brutal uprising in Constantinople. The collapse of the Komnenian regime marked a turning point. With no strong dynasty, imperial authority fragmented. Subsequent emperors lacked legitimacy and effectiveness. The central state weakened, and regions once firmly under imperial control began asserting autonomy. Meanwhile, a new threat emerged in the west. The Crusader movement, once a temporary expedition, became a permanent presence in the eastern Mediterranean. The Latin states in the Levant operated independently, and relations between Byzantium and the Latin West worsened. Religious differences, political distrust, and cultural hostility deepened the divide. Latin merchants, especially from Venice and Genoa, dominated trade, enriching themselves while bypassing Byzantine customs and undermining local economies. By the end of the 12th century, Constantinople remained grand and populous, but the empire around it had grown fragile. The Komnenian restoration had produced outward strength, diplomatic prestige, and cultural brilliance, yet it masked internal fragility. Its reliance on charismatic leadership, foreign mercenaries, and dynastic control created a system that could not survive beyond the family that built it. By the dawn of the 13th century, Byzantium was weakened and divided. The Komnenian restoration had ended. The imperial court fractured, the economy was dominated by foreign merchants, and trust with the Latin West had deteriorated. Into this volatile environment came a disaster of unparalleled scale. The Fourth Crusade, intended to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, would instead result in the sack of Constantinople by Western Christians, one of the most shocking betrayals in medieval history. The origins of the Fourth Crusade were familiar. The papacy's desire to reclaim Jerusalem. After the city fell to Saladin in the late 12th century, Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade. Unlike previous expeditions, this one was meant to be coordinated and disciplined, targeting Egypt, then the center of Muslim power, as a base to reclaim the Holy Land. The plan required naval transport, and the Crusaders turned to Venice. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, agreed to provide ships at a steep price. When the Crusaders failed to raise sufficient funds, the Venetians proposed an alternative: aid in capturing the Christian city of Zara, a rebellious former Venetian colony on the Dalmatian coast. Despite papal condemnation, the Crusaders agreed. This set a precedent for using a religious mission to pursue political and economic goals, even at the expense of fellow Christians. While encamped in Zara, a new opportunity arose. Representatives of a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, offered a stunning proposal. Alexios was the son of deposed Emperor Isaac II, who had been blinded and overthrown by his brother Alexios III. The younger Alexios promised the Crusaders money, military support, and church reunion under papal authority if they helped him reclaim his father's throne in Constantinople. The offer was too tempting. Financial relief, a foothold in the East, and the chance to enforce Latin Christianity on the Orthodox world gave the Crusaders powerful incentives. The crusade, originally bound for Egypt, now turned toward Constantinople. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet appeared before the Byzantine capital. The city was unprepared. Emperor Alexios III, despite the strength of the Theodosian walls, had lost popular and military support. After a brief siege, he fled, leaving the city defenseless. The Crusaders installed Alexios IV and the restored Isaac II as co-emperors, but the alliance quickly unraveled. Alexios IV could not fulfill his extravagant promises: vast payments, military aid, and church union. The Byzantine population resented the Latin presence and saw the new emperor as a puppet. Anti-Latin riots broke out, escalating tensions. In early 1204, a palace coup led by Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mortzouphlos, overthrew and executed Alexios IV. Isaac II died soon after, possibly from neglect or natural causes. Mortzouphlos declared himself Emperor Alexios V and attempted to defend the city against the Crusaders, now with no reason to remain peaceful. With diplomacy exhausted, the Crusaders prepared for war. In April 1204, after several failed attempts, they breached Constantinople's sea walls. The assault was coordinated from land and sea, marking the beginning of one of the most infamous events in medieval history. Venetian ships breached the harbour defences while land forces exploited gaps in the outer walls. After fierce fighting, the Crusaders stormed into the city. What followed was a catastrophe unprecedented in Byzantine history. For 3 days, Constantinople, the largest, wealthiest, and most sacred Christian city in the world, was subjected to looting, destruction, and desecration. Churches were plundered, sacred relics stolen or destroyed, and monasteries burned. The Hagia Sophia, the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, was violated. Horses were stabled in its nave, and drunken soldiers pillaged its treasures. Nuns were assaulted and citizens slaughtered. Latin chroniclers recorded the violence with discomfort, while Byzantine sources recounted it with outrage and horror. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not merely a military defeat. It was a cultural and psychological trauma. Priceless manuscripts, artworks, and relics were lost forever or dispersed across Western Europe. The city that had withstood sieges from Persians, Arabs, and Slavs had now fallen to fellow Christians. In the aftermath, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned emperor, and a Latin patriarch was installed in Hagia Sophia. Western lords carved up the former Byzantine territories into feudal principalities modeled after Western Europe. Venice seized key ports and islands, consolidating commercial dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The remnants of the Byzantine aristocracy and clergy fled. Yet even in this darkest hour, Byzantium did not fully perish. 3 successor states swiftly emerged, claiming imperial legitimacy. The Empire of Nicaea, founded by Theodore Lascaris in Western Asia Minor, became the most prominent. The Despotate of Epirus in the Western Balkans and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast also asserted continuity with Byzantine traditions. These states preserved Orthodox Christianity, maintained aspects of Byzantine administration, and launched efforts to recover lost lands. Meanwhile, the Latin Empire struggled to survive. Despite early optimism, it lacked administrative capacity, local legitimacy, and resources. Greek resistance remained constant, and the empire's territory steadily contracted. The sack of Constantinople marked the nadir of Byzantine history. It shattered the illusion of Christian unity, deepened the schism between East and West, and left an unhealable wound. It also revealed the empire's fundamental vulnerabilities: reliance on diplomacy, fractured politics, and internal divisions. The Byzantine world lay in fragments. With the Latin Empire controlling Constantinople, many assumed the Eastern Roman Empire was finished. Yet the Byzantine tradition endured, relocated, reorganized, and prepared for return. In exile, successor states rose to carry Byzantium's legacy forward. Chief among them was the Empire of Nicaea, which would lead the effort to recapture Constantinople and restore Byzantine rule. In the immediate aftermath of the sack, three primary successor states emerged: the Despotate of Epirus, the Empire of Trebizond, and the Empire of Nicaea. Of these, Nicaea, founded by Theodore I the Lascaris, quickly proved the most organized and politically stable. Theodore, son-in-law of former Emperor Alexios III, had escaped Constantinople's fall and established his court in Nicaea, a strategically defensible city near the old capital. With Constantinople under Latin control, Theodore proclaimed himself emperor, asserting Nicaea's claim to legitimacy. He consolidated local support, organized a functioning bureaucracy, and installed a new patriarch, ensuring religious continuity and Orthodox identity. The early years of Nicaea were spent resisting Latin encroachment from the west and Seljuk pressure from the east. Theodore proved a capable ruler, forging alliances and establishing a professional military. He maintained strong ties with the Orthodox Church, strengthening his regime's spiritual authority. Under Theodore's leadership, Nicaea expanded in northwestern Anatolia and became a refuge for Greek elites, clergy and scholars displaced from Constantinople. Schools, monasteries, and libraries were founded or rebuilt, preserving Byzantium's intellectual life. Upon Theodore's death in the early 13th century, the empire passed to his son-in-law John III Ducas Vatatzes. John III became a central figure in the long road back to Constantinople. His reign was marked by administrative consolidation, military expansion, and cultural revival. He skillfully negotiated with rival Greek states and Western powers, using diplomacy as effectively as warfare. One of John III's key achievements was the systematic recovery of territories in Western Asia Minor and parts of Thrace. He used military pressure and alliances to limit the Latin Empire's influence and curb the ambitions of Epirus and Trebizond. He also forged trade agreements with Western powers like Genoa and Venice, ensuring access to goods while avoiding direct confrontation. Culturally, John III encouraged learning and Orthodox scholarship. He supported theological debate, manuscript copying, and the establishment of schools. The Patriarch in Nicaea functioned as the spiritual center of the Orthodox world, reinforcing the idea that while Constantinople was under Latin control, the true empire persisted in exile. After John III's death, his son Theodore II Lascaris ascended the throne. Educated, intellectually inclined, and deeply committed to moral and cultural revival, Theodore emphasized scholarship and justice. He viewed the empire as both a political entity and a civilizing force rooted in Orthodox values and Roman traditions. However, his reign was brief and marred by aristocratic opposition. Upon his death, the throne passed to his young son, John IV. Real power was soon seized by military commander and nobleman Michael Palaiologos, who positioned himself as protector of the young emperor. Michael gradually eclipsed the Lascaris dynasty and led the final assault on Constantinople. Michael moved decisively. In 1258 he was crowned co-emperor as Michael VIII. Though officially regent, he had no intention of sharing power indefinitely. He dealt ruthlessly with rivals, sidelined the Lascaris family, and consolidated control over the military and administration. Outside Nicaea, the Latin Empire had never been strong. It struggled from the start with insufficient manpower, financial instability, and hostility from Greeks and external enemies. The Latin emperors relied heavily on Venetian naval power and Western mercenaries. Their control barely extended beyond Constantinople, with much of the countryside falling to Greek or Bulgarian rulers. By the mid-13th century, the Latin Empire was in crisis. Resources were exhausted and pressure mounted from Nicaea, Epirus, and Bulgaria. Michael VIII saw his opportunity. In 1261, a Byzantine force under General Alexios Strategopoulos monitored the situation near Constantinople. They found the city weakly defended. Most Latin forces were away on campaign. Acting independently, Alexios launched a surprise attack. Byzantine troops entered through a poorly defended gate and quickly overwhelmed the garrison. The reconquest was nearly bloodless. The Latin emperor fled, and the population greeted Greek soldiers with cautious relief. Within days, Michael VIII entered Constantinople in triumph. After more than half a century in exile, the Byzantines had reclaimed their ancient capital. Michael was crowned emperor in Hagia Sophia, marking the restoration of the Byzantine Empire. The event was momentous, but the city was no longer the Constantinople of old. Latin occupation had left it impoverished and partially ruined. Churches had been desecrated or repurposed, palaces looted, and infrastructure neglected. The once grand capital was now a shadow of its former glory. Michael VIII recognized the symbolic and practical challenges ahead. He acted swiftly to re-establish central authority, revitalize Constantinople, and assert Byzantine legitimacy internationally. Yet the road was difficult. The restored empire was smaller, poorer, and more vulnerable than before the Fourth Crusade. The recapture in 1261 officially restored the Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologan dynasty. Michael VIII stood triumphant in Hagia Sophia, but the victory marked not a new golden age, but the beginning of a slow, painful decline. Internal divisions, economic weakness, and the rise of new adversaries defined the final act of the empire. Michael reclaimed Constantinople, but overextended his resources and alienated key allies. His path to the throne included the blinding and imprisonment of John IV Lascaris, the rightful heir of the Nicaean imperial line. This act horrified many and cast doubt on Michael's legitimacy. Rebuilding Constantinople became Michael's priority. The city had been looted, depopulated, and neglected. Churches lay in ruins, aqueducts were broken, and markets were empty. Michael funded repairs, refortified walls, and re-established state institutions. However, the treasury was overstretched. To finance reconstruction and defense, he imposed heavy taxes and confiscated church properties, provoking unrest among clergy and citizens alike. Externally, hostile powers encircled the empire. Latin principalities in Greece, the Kingdom of Sicily under Charles of Anjou, and expanding Serbian and Bulgarian forces posed constant threats. Michael sought to hold them at bay through diplomacy and alliances. One controversial move was his attempt to reconcile the Orthodox Church with Rome at the Second Council of Lyon in 1234 under papal pressure, and, seeking to prevent Latin invasion, Michael agreed to submit to papal authority and reunify the churches, at least formally. The union was deeply unpopular in Constantinople and the Orthodox East, seen as a betrayal by bishops, monks, and laypeople. While it offered temporary diplomatic relief, it damaged Michael's standing and fueled unrest. After Michael's death, his son, Andronikos II, inherited an empire still struggling from decades of war, occupation, and financial strain. Andronikos attempted reforms, reducing military expenses and relying more on diplomacy. He disbanded the small but effective navy to save money, leaving the empire vulnerable to piracy and diminishing Byzantine influence at sea. Throughout his long reign, Andronikos II faced internal revolts and external threats. The Serbian kingdom under Stefan Dusan rose as a dominant Balkan force. In Anatolia, the weakening of imperial authority allowed Turkish beyliks to expand into former Byzantine territory. Among them, a new power emerged, centered in Sot, the Ottomans. The Ottomans began as a minor frontier emirate, but grew rapidly under dynamic leadership. Their combination of religious zeal, military skill, and effective governance allowed them to absorb neighboring territories and attract warriors from across the region. As Byzantine control in Anatolia collapsed, the Ottomans advanced toward the Bosporus, signaling a new era of peril for the empire. Meanwhile, Byzantium descended into civil war. A bitter succession crisis erupted between Andronikos II and his grandson Andronikos III. This internal struggle dragged on for years, devastating what little remained of the empire's economy and army. Eventually, Andronikos III emerged victorious and attempted to reverse the empire's decline. During his reign, Andronikos III made earnest efforts to revive imperial authority. He rebuilt a modest navy, improved judicial administration, and sought to stabilize finances. Most notably, he relied on his friend and advisor, John Cantacuzénos, who would later become a central political figure. Yet despite these efforts, the structural problems persisted. After Andronikos III's death, another civil war erupted, this time between John Cantacuzénos and the regency of the young emperor John Phib Palaiologos. The conflict lasted for years and invited foreign intervention from nearly every neighboring power, including the Ottomans. This period marked the true beginning of Ottoman involvement in Byzantine affairs. Initially, allies of Cantacuzénos' Ottoman forces were invited across the Bosporus to support his side in the civil war. This was the first Ottoman military presence in Europe, and it would not be the last. What began as a temporary alliance soon turned into permanent settlement. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had crossed into Thrace and captured the vital city of Adrianople, which they renamed Edirne. From there, they launched raids deeper into the Balkans and effectively encircled Constantinople. The Byzantines, with no money, no army, and no reliable allies, were powerless to resist. Desperate for aid, the emperors of Byzantium turned once more to the west. John V travelled to Rome and in 1369 formally submitted to the Pope, accepting the authority of the Roman Catholic Church in hopes of securing military assistance. The response from Western Europe was minimal. While some aid arrived, it was never enough to counter the mounting Ottoman threat. Over the next several decades, the empire continued to shrink. The Black Death struck Constantinople and its remaining territories, killing a large portion of the population and further weakening economic productivity. Remaining provinces in Greece and Anatolia fell under the influence or control of Venice,
Genoa, or local warlords. Despite the decline,
cultural life in Constantinople experienced a modest revival during these final years. The city remained a center of Orthodox theology, philosophical debate, and artistic production. Scholars continued to work in monasteries and schools, copying ancient texts and sustaining intellectual traditions that would later influence the European Renaissance. By the early 15th century, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered holdings in the Peloponnese. The Ottomans, now the dominant regional power, tightened their grip. In one of the most desperate acts of its final decades, the empire once again agreed to a church union at the Council of Florence in 1439. The move, deeply unpopular at home, was an attempt to rally Western support against the Ottomans. But the West had its own concerns. While individual knights and small expeditions arrived, there was no coordinated military response. The Byzantine Empire stood alone. Still, it did not fall quietly. The final emperors, including John VIII and his successor, Constantine V Palaiologos, ruled with dignity and resolve. Constantine, the last Roman emperor, prepared the city's defenses, maintained diplomatic efforts, and sought alliances wherever possible. On the morning of May 29, 1453, Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, fell to the armies of Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. With its collapse came the end of an empire that had begun in antiquity as Rome, transformed into Byzantium, and endured as a unique fusion of Roman law, Hellenistic culture, and Orthodox Christianity. The fall of Constantinople was more than the capture of a city. It was the final act in one of history's longest and most remarkable imperial stories. In the years leading up to the siege, Constantinople was a shadow of its former self. The once grand capital, home to emperors, scholars, and saints, had been reduced to a walled city with a population likely numbering only in the tens of thousands. Much of its urban space had become ruralized. Churches lay in partial ruin, aqueducts no longer functioned, and large swaths of land inside the Theodosian walls were given over to agriculture. Emperor Constantine V Palaiologos was acutely aware of the threat facing his city. Since the Ottomans had captured Adrianople, their presence in Europe had only expanded. Sultan Mehmed II, who had ascended the Ottoman throne at a young age, was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to conquer Constantinople. He understood the city's symbolic and strategic importance, not only as a gateway between Europe and Asia, but as a prize that would legitimize his rule as a new Caesar. Constantine knew he could not hold the city alone. Over the years, successive emperors had appealed to Western Europe for help, offering religious union with the papacy in return. At the Council of Florence, the Byzantine delegation had formally accepted union with the Roman Church. But the response in Constantinople was bitterly divided. Orthodox clergy, monastic communities, and much of the population rejected the compromise, seeing it as a betrayal of their faith. Nevertheless, Constantine maintained the union in hopes of Western aid. Some assistance arrived, though not enough to turn the tide. A small contingent of Genoese soldiers, led by the experienced commander Giovanni, arrived in the city, along with a few hundred adventurers from various parts of Europe. Yet the bulk of the defense relied on the city's dwindling population and poorly equipped militias. In contrast, Mehmed II assembled a massive modern army. Estimates suggest it numbered in the tens of thousands, including elite janissaries, irregular cavalry, and siege engineers. A decisive factor was the use of gunpowder artillery. Mehmed had commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build some of the largest cannons ever seen. These massive bombards relentlessly pounded Constantinople's walls. The siege began in early April 1453. Mehmed's forces surrounded the city by land and sea. The Ottomans built a fleet to blockade the Bosporus and laid siege lines around the Theodosian walls. The defenders, outnumbered and isolated, had few options. Constantine V led from the front, organizing defenses and boosting morale. Giustiniani and his men held key positions along the land walls, especially at vulnerable gates. The Ottoman bombardment began immediately. Day after day, massive stones were hurled at the walls. Sections collapsed, but were hastily rebuilt at night by the defenders. The double and triple layers of ancient walls proved remarkably resilient, but the psychological toll of constant shelling was severe. Despite their superior numbers, the Ottomans faced difficulties. Defenders launched daring sorties to destroy siege engines and harass the besiegers. At sea, Byzantine and Genoese ships initially held their own. In a remarkable maneuver, defenders used a massive chain to block the Golden Horn, preventing Ottoman ships from entering the harbor. But Mehmed responded ingeniously, building a wooden roadway over land and rolling ships on greased logs past Galata into the Golden Horn. When the defenders awoke to find an Ottoman fleet in the harbor, their naval advantage was gone. The noose around the city tightened. For over 50 days, the siege continued. Food and supplies ran low. Panic and desperation spread. Yet Constantine refused to surrender, knowing what the conquest of Constantinople would mean, not just for the city, but for Orthodox Christianity, Roman identity, and the legacy of his imperial ancestors. On the night of May 28th, the final liturgy was held in Hagia Sophia. It was a moment of sorrow, unity, and resignation. Greek and Latin Christians, divided for centuries, stood side by side in prayer. Emperor Constantine received communion with soldiers and citizens before returning to the walls for what he likely knew would be the last time. At dawn on May 29th, Mehmed launched his final assault. Waves of Ottoman soldiers attacked the crumbling walls. The defenders resisted fiercely, but their lines eventually broke. Giustiniani was wounded and carried away, causing morale to collapse in a critical section. Ottoman forces poured through breaches, overwhelming the remaining resistance. Constantine Zaifin fought to the end. According to accounts, he removed his imperial regalia and charged into battle, dying anonymously alongside his soldiers. His body was never definitively identified, and legends spread that he would one day return to reclaim the city. Mehmed II entered Constantinople later that day. He ordered his men to stop looting, entered Hagia Sophia, and offered prayers. The great church, once the spiritual heart of Byzantium, was converted into a mosque. Though battered, the city was spared the complete destruction seen in previous sacks. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves across the Christian world. In Western Europe it was met with disbelief and mourning, yet no major military intervention followed. The Byzantine Empire, which had outlived the Western Roman Empire by nearly a millennium, was no more. Yet Byzantium's legacy survived. The Orthodox Church continued under Ottoman rule, with the ecumenical patriarch retaining authority over Orthodox Christians. Byzantine scholars fleeing the city carried manuscripts and classical knowledge to Western Europe, fueling the intellectual revival that would become the Renaissance. The city, renamed Istanbul, became the new Ottoman capital. Mehmed II, styled the Conqueror, envisioned himself as heir to the Roman Caesars. In his court, Roman traditions were absorbed and adapted. Blending with Turkish and Islamic governance, Byzantium lived on in memory, in the architecture of Russian cathedrals, in Orthodox liturgy, in Balkan laws and customs, and in the ideals of empire and faith that shaped generations. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of an empire, but not the end of its influence. From its beginnings in the Eastern Roman world through centuries of war, faith, crisis, and recovery, Byzantium had endured against all odds. It preserved classical knowledge, developed unique Christian thought, and acted as a cultural and political bridge between ancient and modern.
East and West. It was not just an empire of marble and mosaics, but of ideas and identity.
Though the city fell, Byzantium's legacy continues to echo in the annals of world history.